this kind of showing a little leg in order to sell your music.
I
Devin, last time we spoke was in July of last year, before you
remember.
went into. I am glad to be that memorable. Before you went into this touring hiatus to focus on The Moth, and I
Yeah,
guess a bunch of other things. So, how
yeah.
was that time off from touring?
Well, it seems like life just in general just shifts its stresses to whatever it is that you're doing. So any relief that I got from not touring for that year was counteracted by just personal things that ended up happening. But I'm grateful that I was at home for them. You know, as difficult as they were, when there's things going on with the family and you're on tour, it's a very helpless feeling. So, although it has been very stressful for the past year, just due to family things, I'm grateful that I was at home for it, you know?
When we discuss PowerNet, I want to go a little bit into some of the issues that ended up affecting the lyrical
Yeah.
content of PowerNerd.
Mm,
But before we do that, I wanted to ask you something because as I was preparing the interview, I kind of took a deep dive into your origin story, for lack of a better word.
yeah.
Um, you were very open at the beginning about how quickly you were disillusioned by the music industry, the chasm
Yeah.
that existed between what it was that you expected, what it actually was. In fact, you said, and this is your word, that you were, despite your naivete, you were deflowered pretty
Yeah.
quickly. Tell me a little bit about this deflowering, because you were very young. It's coming off horribly, but we'll get there. You were very young when you started. You were around 19 when you started touring with Steve Vai. So I'm curious about what you actually expected to find at that age.
Yeah, I was too young to understand the industry as a money-making apparatus versus the romantic vision that I perhaps had of it when I was younger. I think most of us in the 80s, at least, when we had stars in our eyes about being in a band, sort of bought into some of the fantasy that had been portrayed by music videos, I guess, more than anything else. Remember when I was a kid seeing videos by like Rat and Motley Crue, and it looked like the lifestyle was just so wonderful. You know, it's playing to lots of people, and people love the music and sex, drugs, and rock and roll and the whole thing. Um, and I think a lot of what was perpetuated by the industry at that time was that fantasy, so that people who were external from it could find some sort of solace in thinking that there was this idealistic world, right? And I think for me, much of that played into the fact that I loved and love music so much that I assumed that clearly the foundation for being involved with the music industry is art and emotions and music. It was naive, you know, as a kid. And then when I get down there and I realize, oh no, it's an industry. It's like anything else. And it's in Los Angeles and there's certain aspects of it that are very cutthroat and much of what you end up doing as a professional musician has very little to do with music. Now more than ever, I realize now that 90% of the job is to be a content creator rather than write any music, right? And these are the sorts of realizations that I found to be very jarring when I was a kid. And yeah, I found that within the first year, less than that, within the first 6 months, I was made painfully aware of what the nature of the industry is. And I don't resent it or think of it as being something that needs to change. It's just what it is. It's like any industry. I just didn't know. And the transition between the idealistic version of what I thought it was versus the practicalities of what it takes to be a musician was, I guess, upsetting as a kid.
But I think that based on the things that I've heard you say, not just during this conversation, but in general, that the thing that bothered you was mostly the lack of commitment to art, much more so than the fact that there weren't enough jacuzzis, prostitutes, and cocaine in the backstage. In the sense that as fun as that might be, you don't strike me as the kind of person who, well, I just got into this in order to get laid and in order to get high.
Ah,
Not that, not that those things are not fun.
of course.
It seems more vapid than I think you actually are, right?
Well, I mean, I appreciate that. That's a compliment. I thank you for it. I might not live up to that. I might be more vapid than I think I am. But what I do recall from that period was the intrinsic nature of uh, the creative process is something that I've been fascinated by for a long time because I'm still trying to figure out, or not even figure out, but wrap my head around where music comes from, like where art comes from. Is it, and it's a silly thing to think about as much as I do, but I just do, right? And one of the conclusions that I think I've come to over the years is that the creative compulsion is part of our own makeup, but the ideas that come to us are kind of ephemeral. They kind of exist independent of us. It's like every melody that could be created already exists in a sense. And as a result of that, since the very beginning, I felt that my connection to music is one of reverence, where I feel that music is very um, um, uh, significant in a way that is beyond our capacity to comprehend even. And so to have that creative compulsion monetized in the way that it needs to be in order to continue, I just found that it was like in direct opposition to each other, like those two sort of frames of mind. And again, I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing. It was just if you're coming into something thinking of it as a certain thing, and then you come to realize that it's the opposite. There's just a transition period that happens, and I think that transition period is how I spent the majority of my time with Steve Vai.
You know, I was recently speaking with a band that's called Windrose, and they do
Yeah,
dwarven power metal, right?
yeah, yeah. I saw
So,
that. Yeah,
so they are apparently. I found this out recently because I'm way too old for TikTok, but they are apparently very successful on TikTok. And one of the ways they've done it is by, you kind of figure out what works within that environment, and then you start to create content like that. And I asked them, and those who want to know the answer to that can watch that one. But basically whether they felt that that was a constraint for them. Now, obviously, they are newer musicians, so or newer professional musicians, let's say. So for them, it is the environment in which they developed, so that is
right.
just part of the things that you need to do. But I can
That's
imagine that for people who precede the necessity of relying on social media, of putting out trailers and updates and unboxings and all this bullshit that you need to see in every social media must be just genuinely exhausting.
First off, thank you for the recognition of that, because not only are you correct, but I think it's something that a lot of people in the music industry, specifically in sort of the positions that I reside in, sort of mid-level in a small genre, um, there's a lot of people that just refuse to do it, right? And I can understand that because, as you say, if you weren't raised in that environment, it seems like it's in direct opposition to why you got into it in the first place. And I can certainly sympathize with that sentiment. However, um, the reality of it is that it's simply what it takes at this point to create engagement with an audience that is so distracted that the choice is ours. And I find that the position I'm in right now, because I took time off, like I've taken about 2 years off of social media, where prior to that I was very active on it. But I just found that the exhaustion that comes from these constant updates is just, it's less even the workload that goes into creating content like this. It's more of the implication that, at least for me, that what I do is so important that it warrants that amount of silly videos. Like every morning, I woke up this morning and I got requests for another like 5 or 10 videos of me doing stupid shit, like you say. Like, you know, shitgobbler.uk wants a video of you dancing on one foot and yelling the name of your new record or something. You know what I mean? It's like, and as someone who,
I'm actually the editor in chief of Shit Gobbler, so
I
I
know
take
this is,
good offense.
I didn't want to be I didn't want to complain directly, but I figured that as a Canadian, passive aggressively, I could throw it across your, but, I think the thing is, you either do it or you don't, right? And that's entirely your prerogative. But my work is so important to me that in order to continue doing it, I have started to reconcile that I need to really get that sort of part of my world in gear. And I think that the people who hate it and the people that I relate to, they're like, oh, dude, like this shit is it's so annoying. Um, they're probably not going to be on those platforms in the first place. So, so I think that whatever sense of humiliation comes from dancing on one foot for shitgobbler.uk, thank you for the opportunity, by the way, is something that you just have to get on with, man. And I'm currently in the process of reconciling this change because it happened much quicker than a lot of us expected. And I think there's going to be a lot of people from my generation that'll just be left behind because they just have no desire to do so or don't see the importance of doing so. But regrettably, there is an importance in it.
But at the same time, of course, this kind of showing a little leg in order to sell your music uh, is is not new in the sense that, for example, I remember a few years ago watching Michael Ackerfeld have a conversation with with Steve Wilson.
I don't know what type of photos a metal band should have, but what I see is like this.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
every metal hammer cut,
yeah, yeah. It's the cliche. Yeah,
and I can't do that.
yeah.
I've done a few, and I just see, like, and I see those pictures, I see in my eyes, I'm suffering. I just did a photo session with Angela from Arch Enemy for a cover of a magazine, and she went with I was standing with a sword, like this.
Oh, that one's going framed on my wall.
And it was like almost like from the bad news.
Yeah, Warriors.
You
of Genghis
got to
Khan.
look mean. That's what I felt like.
And the problem is that I guess a lot of people imagine that that is just a picture that was almost like a candid image of
Yeah,
musicians just randomly showing up with an axe
yeah,
at
yeah,
the Metal Hammer Studios,
yeah,
whereas in
yeah.
reality it's always just this trying to create some sort of engagement.
This is nothing new. And certain territories are a lot more notorious. The UK is notorious for that. They're like, you show up for a photo shoot and they got like a propeller beanie and a clown nose, and they're saying, here, let's promote your new work. We need to create engagement. It's not obviously just the UK, it happened in Canada too. Um, I would say the majority of those sort of crazy photos of mine uh, were uh, were photographers asking me to do something wacky, and I feel that again. The main priority for me in terms of all of this industry is to continue being creative in a musical realm. And I guess there's a part of me that feels like if what it takes for me to continue is to put on a propeller beanie and a clown nose, then sure, let me have it. And if it goes past a certain threshold where I just feel uncomfortable, I'll say no. But for the most part, that's just been going on for so many years. And I was thinking about it this morning, honestly, is so many musicians nowadays, like right now, as we are talking, are in the process of needing to reconcile whether or not they're willing to do this kind of social media engagement. And again, it's our prerogative. But if you don't, the criteria in which a lot of these labels and opportunities and management and these people gauge whether or not you're successful is regrettably all those things that benefit from social media engagement. So, you either should or get off the pot at this point, and I'm just waiting for the turd to boil over because at this point I've been pretty resistant, but I don't think there's going to be much time left for me to be resistant before I'm just going to have to dig in and start doing these things.
It's interesting though, because since you were speaking about this issue of where art comes from, and I guess that to an extent, although not exactly the same, where popularity comes from. And
Mm.
now I think that you are also in this challenging thing that when you create content, you're not really creating it for people, you're creating it for an algorithm that then chooses, quote unquote, to show it to some people, right? So that
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what you, if you do what you do is good or bad, it has to fit within what the algorithm is kind of boosting.
Well, I wonder then, so if somebody was to begin the process of figuring out what they would post, because I think that's the fundamental problem for a lot of us, is just uh, you do videos, you do track by track, you do gear reviews, you do all these sorts of things, but it's an endless well that needs to be constantly filled, like, bailing out a canoe with a hole in it. So with that, your workload comes down to, well, what do I do? What do I film myself saying? Is it, if it's just for an algorithm, is it as innocuous as just setting up a camera and saying, okay, for the next 4 hours, I'm going to record myself doing stuff. Here's me talking about a guitar. Here's me talking about the record. Here's me talking about the process. Here's me talking about a tour, whatever. My frame of mind on all of this that we've talked about, and I actually really appreciate you bringing it up because it was on my mind this morning, really comes down to how do you do those things that are clearly required in 2024 in order to um, get your work into the public eye? How do you do those with a level of authenticity that's congruent with the work? Because that's my main criteria for whatever album I do, is whether or not it resonates with me and accurately represents the time in which it was written. That's really the criteria. And the disconnect that I have with social media at this point is just trying to reconcile the amount of content that's needed with um, the authenticity, because a lot of that content is just not interesting to me as a human being. Like, I see some 22-year-old podcaster with 7 million subscribers, and he just loves getting up in the morning and sitting in front of a camera and playing video games and talking about it, right? And it's like, and so the reason why people are engaged by that is because he's engaged by it. And there's the difference. It's like it's one thing to follow a compulsion if you're younger and that's what you want to do. You love filming yourself and being seen. But it's another thing if you're just vomiting out content in hope that the algorithm will latch onto it. And so the trick, I believe, is finding an angle in which I or anybody in my position can actually enjoy making that content. Because if you do, then it's less like it's like some vapid obligation, and it's more like this is me actively engaged in something that hopefully people who participate in the music would be engaged with as well. And it's a trick I'm finding because I don't care.
But I think that it is interesting because I fully agree with you in the sense that people like I've checked the Devin Townsend subreddit or some groups on Facebook. The people who are there, they don't want you to see they don't want to see you necessarily doing stupid shit. They want to see you engaged with the stuff
Yeah,
that you do, the stuff that you like. The
yeah,
problem is that when the industry expects you to have large followings, it is not enough to say, well, I found a niche and I'm really appealing excellent to that niche because it is not going to be a million, 2 million, 3 million people. So I
yeah.
guess that the pressures there are more challenging.
Well, it's interesting too because a lot of what I have focused on over the past few years at least is servicing the existing fan base because um, I'm old enough now and I've been doing this long enough to recognize that me pursuing significant success with a demographic that is not going to relate to the content is a waste of my energy, really. Yet the opportunities that come to me that allow my work to flourish are often brought to me based on the numbers that come back on engagement on social media. So if you're if your monthly report on your social media engagement is, you're up 0.7% on Instagram and down 0.12% on Twitter or whatever it is, um, whatever you're trying to sell is of less significance now, musically or otherwise, than those numbers. So if I want to, which I do, actualize all these creative things that come into my frame of mind as a compulsion, it's tangibly important to have those numbers increase. So I think that where I'm at right now is is brainstorming what sort of content I can provide that is authentic. Last week alone, I got asked to do all these engagement videos and shout out videos and all these sorts of things. And while I'm doing it, the only thing I feel is resentment. It's not like a sense of like, oh, this is something I'm engaged with, and I hope. It's just like hurling shit into this void. And because management label, people are, no one knows what is happening. Like you look at AI, you look at all these things that happen, and it shifts so daily that you can make this content with full intention and a pure heart even, but it's of very little significance. It's just it goes into this pit, and then it comes out on Mondays and Tuesdays, and it's such that that could become such a grind that you end up resenting the thing that you once loved. So again, the objective that I have for myself as an artist right now is over the next couple of weeks, I would imagine, is understand to the best of my ability how these algorithms work for each one of these platforms, and then be able to brainstorm content that I can feel psychologically and creatively comfortable enough to deliver, and then start to engage from that point of view. Because otherwise, I just don't think anybody gives a shit about seeing, the singer of a band from the '80s, for example, trying unsuccessfully to engage a bunch of kids on TikTok when he doesn't give a fuck about it. It's like I just think it's a lot of energy for the artist that is not really going to go anywhere, and I just don't know who the demographic that they're trying to service with that would be. So it's a fine line, right?
Yeah, and it really has this kind of
How do you do, fellow kids?
vibe
I agree,
to it, and
100%.
you don't want to come off like that.
I think that what is most important from an artist point of view, at least from my point of view, is what's your motivation for going viral, for example. Like, not that I have, not that I want to, but just like if somebody from a consultant firm comes up and says, "This is what you need to do to go viral," the ramifications of going viral, as we've witnessed throughout the past decade, can be a two-edged sword. You can get that young lady who was the Hawk Tuah girl was talking about putting saliva on a penis. And now she's worth 13 million as a result of running with that uh, um, opportunity, that viral opportunity. Yet, what comes with that is such visibility that unless you are an anomaly like that, which very few people ever will be, uh, your your viral throw is often just going to cause problems. you
Yeah, in all
know?
likelihood, it's going to be like kind of young, like people who are like child stars or something. It's going to create similar challenges. The challenge, of course, on a societal basis, and this is way outside of the realm of what I thought we were going to end up discussing, is that when there are surveys done of young children, particularly in the West, what we see is that the vast majority of them want to be famous on the internet. So in the same way that you were saying, well, why do you want to go viral? In this case, is why would you want to be famous, or what do you want to do that would make you famous? So that
Or
fame starts to become an objective in and of itself.
yeah, and or what level of fame can you as a human being tolerate in order to continue the thing that you love? I think this is where I'm at because I recognize as I get older and the longer that I've done this job, uh, the things that perhaps initially motivated my need to be seen or validated have in large part been worked out over the past 30 years. You know, when I first started, my insecurity and my self-effacing sort of tendencies created an environment where I was looking for attention, like any kid, really. And once I got a certain amount of a certain amount of that attention, and I was fortunate, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, to experience the ramifications of that type of attention, both positive and negative, you start to understand where those sorts of things fit into your life and what works for you and what doesn't. So again, the intent of why we do these things needs to be focused on before any action is taken. Because if you become successful or viral for something that you're uncomfortable with, then it completely negates whatever sort of creative potential might come from that engagement. You know, it's one thing to do wacky shit on a video to get attention, like I'm gonna eat a bunch of ants or stick, you know,
You keep looking around your office to see if there's something to eat.
yeah. Well, I got nothing so far. It's just my dog here, but I think that but you know what I mean? It's like you might do something like, you know what would get a lot of attention? Yeah, you know what? I could get a lot of attention right now for like jerking off in front of a computer, you know, and but it's not going to benefit my ability to to continue creating things past that point. But that's where I think as artists we have to put a bit of foresight into this, because what is it that you're willing to do? Like, to what extent are you willing to do this? And I think that what may be the solution for those of us who have got very little desire to get attention by being provocative, I think it's just volume. I think you just need to have shitloads of content and then be able to send it to the team, whether or not it's your label or management, or, you know, if you're fortunate enough, or yourself, and then just have your visibility be consistent. I think that's probably, for someone in my position, the most important thing to do is just visibility rather than what the specifics of that content could be.
Briefly on the topic of you exposing yourself on camera, the there was you were lucky then that because you sent a physical copy of a picture of your anus to a record executive,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah.
And in your podcast, you mentioned that early on in your career, you had a problem with, I think, a record executive, and you sent him a picture of, you said anus, but I don't know if it was the balloon knot itself or the entire butt.
Well, the anus was involved for sure. I think that there's also a distinction to be made, and you will probably disagree, but you know, maybe it's a cultural thing, between showing your ass when you're young because you're trying to get attention for showing your ass versus fuck you. And I
No, I
think
get that. I fully agree with you on that. What I'm saying is that it's fortunate that this was done at a time when that didn't end up immediately on the internet.
you know, I think because my intention was fuck you, I don't think it would have caused problems. I think had it been me sheepishly showing my asshole to a predator, I think that would have been a different set of circumstances. But no, this was just me being a prick when I was 19, and I think there's a lot of room for that still.
You know, since we're talking about these topics, and part of them have to do with the edginess of your youth, and because you mentioned them in an interview, I saw that you're a dad, something that I didn't know up until recently. So without
Well,
going into details about your kid, how do you feel, or how much do you think about my kid is gonna read this one day?
well, it's inevitable, so you have to own it. I mean, I think the thing that goes with it, it's like I talked to my father about, and people in his generation, the boomer generation, of how disappointed they are that Gen Z or Gen Alpha they're not walking to school and they're having to do all these sorts of things. And boy, if that was my kid, I would send him to school and he would be all these sort of things. But what I have commented to them is I said, yeah, but if you raise kids in 2024 in the same way that you raised kids in 1950, they're just going to get killed. They're just going to get killed. They're going to go to jail. I mean, it's like, so the perspective on that is similar to how you would choose to, if you did, um, hide your kid from any of your past activities that are fully there for anybody to see. So the technique that I chose is I just sat him down at one point and I said, listen, here's the experience that I had with drugs. Here's the experience I had with sex. Here's the experience I had with all these things. And any questions that you have about the ramifications of these drugs or any of these things, ask me. And as a result of that, I think that the immediacy that kids are wanting to talk about these things implies that in the same way as trying to raise kids with a 1950s mentality in terms of walking home from school, if you try to raise kids in 2024 with the same sort of Puritan tendencies that existed in a different era, they're also going to be unprepared. So I think that as a parent, your obligations at this point is more about transparency than ever before. Because
Right,
yes,
especially when all of your stuff is out there. I
yeah,
mean,
what are you going to do? Just say, Listen, whatever you do, don't look." It's like
don't read my books.
whatever you do, don't look at the videos that I put out every week and the book that I put out and then the next book. You know what I mean? It's like it's not realistic. So with that comes another type of reconciliation with what modern life is. And where I think we start to struggle and stumble as we get older as musicians is, I think, just as human beings, your capacity to change tends to diminish every year as you get older and you become more stuck in your ways. And the only type of music that was ever good was insert era here when you were 22, or whatever, right? And so, with that in mind, it's just the only constant to all of this is change, and you just have to try and reconcile it. And if you're through that reconciliation, you come to the conclusion that it's not for you, then you don't do it. It's what it is. There's ramifications to it, but you don't have to.
Before you mentioned that, as your career has continued, you've kind of moved away a little bit from the more self-effacing or self-deprecating approaches.
Hmm.
Having watched the video for Power Nerd, for example, or a lot of videos that you put out, you maintain to some extent some of this self-deprecating humor, and because of the things I've read that you've said, for example, about the difficulty of developing, and these are interviews that you've done in the last three
Yeah, yeah,
years,
of
and
course,
so
of
not
course.
not something going back. The challenge of developing self-love and self-respect in a way, respecting yourself. Um, how much of your self-deprecation is just about I'm
Self-defense.
making fun of myself, therefore my audience cannot laugh at me.
Less than it was. I think at one point that was the foundation of it. But now I find that my physical presence in the world or in the industry is more of an analogy for where I was at with the music. And it's I think there's also a distinction between being self-deprecating and just not giving a shit. Like, I mean, I don't care if people see me in a superhero outfit and think that I look like a tool bag. Like, I just don't care. And the reason I don't care is because fuck, man, over the past year I had to move, I had to build furniture, and I'm qualified only on the most basic level to do any of that shit. So the Power Nerd video for me was less about being self-deprecating and more about that's how I felt for the past year. You know what I mean? And to have a physical vehicle to represent that is I just don't find it embarrassing is the bottom line. I think it's maybe in the past, yeah, I was more self-deprecating based on self-defense and trying to beat people to the punch. But I honestly feel that at this point in my life, it's much less about that and more just about, oh, that seems appropriate to me, and I don't mind it if people think that it's ridiculous, right?
As for the album Power Nerd, you obviously know that in an attempt to hype up a record, labels kind of freestyle a little bit the biography of the album.
Sure,
So one of the things that they highlighted a lot in this case is that it was written, the music at least, in 11 days.
sure.
How accurate is that?
Uh, More so than it sounds, because I totally understand how the hype of it is just so tiring. I'll put it to you this way: the process for writing music for me is a long-term endeavor, just in general. So I constantly write, and then I categorize the ideas that I have based on a certain criteria. Like this one is heavy, so it goes onto a heavy pile. This one's orchestral, it goes onto an orchestral pile. This one's melodic, this one's abstract, whatever the categories may be. And then when they become populated enough with ideas, not with songs, with ideas, that I feel that there's potential there for it to manifest into a complete statement, I then take it to the next stage, which usually takes about 2 months, which is where I take those uh, germs of ideas and I start to turn them into an identity that is a little more congruent with an overarching theme. And usually that process takes 2 months. With Power Nerd, I limited myself to 11 days for two reasons. One, because the deadline was tight, and I wanted to spend the time working on certain aspects of the production I was in a new studio and I was unsure about certain sonic things.
Sorry to interrupt. When you say deadline, you mean the self-imposed deadline of 11 days is short, or the deadline that you had for the label to put up a record?
Sorry, the label from the deadline from the label. So I basically had a 2 month period to deliver this. And so I relegated only 11 days to the process that usually takes 2 months, not only for the deadline, but because the nature of the material in that pile seemed to imply that it would benefit from a type of urgency that I thought a limitation on time would potentially provide. Plus, my tendency to overthink fucking everything is such that if the nature of the music is straightforward and it's kind of like party music in a way, it may benefit it from imposing these kind of deadlines on it, uh, separate from the label, just in terms of like that part of the process. So, how accurate is it? Fairly, but it's not that it came in from absolute zero. There were seeds of songs prior. It's just a process that usually takes 2 months. I spent 11 days on this time.
I read that originally your plan was to make it kind of just like a fun, relaxed record, but that life got in the way, and that in the end it was lyrically, it couldn't really be this Def Leppard, Scorpions,
No,
sorry, Poison thing. Tell me a little bit about that, to an extent, of course, that you're comfortable. This Genesis.
I think much of the reason why my creative um, compulsions have been as overwhelming as they seem to have been for the majority of my career is because as a human being, I feel maybe a little disconnected from my emotions for whatever reason. I mean, we could hypothesize either, the upbringing or traumas or whatever, just a lot like a lot of us. To be present constantly emotionally is a bit of a lie, or was a bit of a liability, specifically as a new father and certain things that as a hypersensitive person, if I overreact to things, which I'm wont to do, it can cause problems. So long story long is I've learned over the years to kind of compartmentalize my emotions and intellectualize them. So when I'm feeling something, I'm able to articulate what I'm feeling without actually having to participate in them. Over the course of the writing of Power Nerd, we went through a bunch of things as a family, just loss essentially. And the process of that, for the first time ever, either due to fatigue or age or just a combination of circumstance, it was the first time that I felt like I was unable to compartmentalize these emotions. And um, I just, it's like when a crack in the dam appears, it's eventually the pressure that goes to that crack is such that the dam breaks. And it was almost like a lifetime of emotional repression. I was very close to my grandparents, and all four of them passed away, for example, the year my son was born, and I never really processed that. Or I had a couple friends pass away over the past couple of years, let alone recently, but they were never really processed because I was in the midst of trying to just provide and do all these things. But with this, again, either age, fatigue, whatever the combination of circumstances were, it made it such that the emotions just started coming out. And brother, once they started coming out, I couldn't stop them. And it was an insane feeling because I think I've had a certain amount of pride in my ability to remain composed during moments of stress. And this time it's like I couldn't, and I just then it's like I'd never really cried in the past. Then all of a sudden it's like I started crying and I couldn't stop. It's like everything started making me cry, and I felt like I was going insane. You know what I mean? I'm like, what the fuck is this? Like, how is this going to possibly serve any practical purpose? I remember like somebody came into the studio and I had to pretend I was yawning. You know what I mean? I'm like, and
That happened to me a couple of years ago. I was at a festival, and a number
yeah,
of things had happened. And I suddenly, are you okay? I'm just have this fucking allergy, man. I don't know what the
that's
fuck. It's
exactly it.
just,
That's
it's this
exactly
dust.
it.
and, I,
Exactly what I
and
was
it
doing. And
was
I
a very, because I'm 40 years old now, but it was like the first time in my life when I go, why am I crying uncontrollably?
That's it. I think this is, because I'm 52 now, and I think that there is a certain amount of like there is absolutely a certain amount of hormonal change that happens at this age. And I think that it's a complicated thing to say out loud because it's like I still haven't quite understood what happened. But all I know is the emotions just started coming out due to two instances that happened during the writing of Power Nerd where we lost people, and I just uh and it just informed the entire process in a way that was very difficult and completely unexpected. And I had to try and compensate for this sort of emotional instability that I was wholly unprepared for and unqualified for, by the way, because if you go for your entire life without expressing these sorts of things, and then it starts tumbling out, you're just, you start crying at an aspirin commercial for some reason, and you're just like, what the fuck? So that's in a nutshell what ended up happening, and having to navigate that while still trying to remain focused on deadlines and the technical aspects of the work and all these things was just a real. There was a certain point where I honestly felt like I was not going to have the mental um, fortitude to complete it. I was so uh, sort of broken in a sense by the whole experience that I couldn't rationalize a lot of the work that was needing to be done and the problem solving. But we worked through it. And if there's anything that warrants the name Power Nerd, the process that we went through in order to actualize this record is that.
Yeah, I was reading the definition of power nerd. A person of any gender who has, through tenacity and perseverance, turned what society may deem as weakness into a superpower. So in
Yeah,
this
man.
case, this pain became, to an extent, your superpower.
Yeah, well, I'm even beyond a superpower. It's something that I recognized fairly quickly that part of the process was reconciling the fact that these are human emotions. These are not uh, problems to be quelled. These are things that up to this point I had just not been emotionally aware enough to be able to participate in authentically. So difficult as it was, there was a real sense of progress that came from having no choice but to kind of sit with these hard emotions that previously I was able to kind of ignore, right? So the superpower in that point is accepting that these sorts of things, these hypersensitivities, these emotional reactions to things that are very natural, are um, are progressive. Like now that I'm participating in them, there's less of a fear of them. And yeah, so that's an example of exactly what you just mentioned.
I can imagine, of course, that being in that space mentally, creating something that was in line with your original idea of just something relaxed and poisony or scorpiony would not have worked.
No, and by that time I was committed, so the conundrum was real. But what was interesting about it is when I got the music done and then I sat and tried to add the vocals to it in the ways that were similar to the original intent, it just the awfulness of that sentiment in combination with the frame of mind I found myself in was just it wasn't interesting enough. I didn't want to do like an ironic statement. It's either this is authentic, and the way it was authentic in the beginning is it's part of a four record cycle with the Moth, Axolotl, and Ruby Quaker, so that it acted as like a simple intro. It's like extending an olive branch to an audience that tends to be very tolerant of some of the weird shit that I've been doing lately. And it just, when I got into it, it just seemed wildly inappropriate to follow with the original idea. So it just required, amidst all those emotions, reevaluating what the intent of the record was. And it was, I admit, it was very difficult to do that. Plus, we were moving, plus, kids leaving home and all these things. So when it came to doing the Power Nerd video, I was just like, yeah, that's exactly how I feel.
Since you mentioned that it is a quadrilogy, right? So it is Power Nerd, The Moth, Axolotl, and Ruby Quaker. I thought that Ruby Quaker was going to be a YouTube show.
It is. It is. But it's a YouTube show about a spaceship that I've built that travels through the universe powered by music. And so I do I have no shame, brother. And I've built this spaceship that I do improvisation as we're flying through space. And each one of them is about 20 minutes, and we've already recorded 15 of them. So once that show comes out, it's essentially once a month, and that's part of like the engagement idea that I've had that allows me to participate in something that I still feel that I can get behind. Like I care about that, and that's been the whole trick is finding angles that are reasonably easy to actualize that I care about. And the Ruby Quaker thing was something that I think is really cool. And so by the end of it, I'm going to have essentially 15 or 20-minute long improvisation pieces that I intend to flesh out. And then for the fourth record, sort of put out a box set of all of it that includes those improvisations as part of the aesthetic for the Ruby Quaker um, component of that quadrilogy.
When we talk about, for example, the Star Wars trilogy or the Lord of the Rings trilogy, there is a thematic connection throughout them, right? Like a story.
Yeah, yeah,
In your case, when we talk about the quadrilogy of let's call it the Moth quadrilogy for
sure.
for
Yeah,
simplicity,
yeah,
what connects these records? Is it going to be the themes that you touch upon, or just
yeah.
the space where you were?
Well, I think that every period of at least my work, and I would argue probably most artists, is based on being able to identify, even subconsciously, the overarching theme that seems to be prevalent in one's life during the period in which these pieces of music are being written. And what it seems like the continuity between the quadrilogy is the idea of change, and that can either be represented by death or transformation or uh, you know accepting the fluid nature of the creative process so that the linear structures that we're so used to musically are no longer applicable. So in the case of Power Nerd, change is represented by death. In the case of the moth overarching, the same sort of transformation is turned into an analogy in the sense of a caterpillar into a moth, and then the story that adheres itself to that. And then for Axolotl, the idea of change and the inevitability of it is represented by the fluid nature of the arrangements, because that record is definitely a very abstract and sort of alien sounding project that doesn't adhere to the same sort of structures that we're so used to. And then for Ruby Quaker, the idea of leaving the Earth in order to find an area of the universe that is preferable implies on the surface looking for change, and the act of discussing that process through that series will draw the other three records into it from the point of view of like, this is all about change. And I mean, it's again, when I talk about these things, and only because asked, of course, it can come across as being exceptionally pretentious, because it seems like by explaining these things, I hear myself talking, it sounds like you're trying to cure cancer or something. But it's not that.
I have to be honest. I didn't get the impression that you were being pretentious. I've heard musicians do pretentious explanations. I didn't get that vibe.
I appreciate it because that's just an explanation of it. And I think that, my compulsion to create is really unconscious. Like, I don't analyze the work, or at least I try not to on a conscious level yet, because, like this week alone, I've done 20 interviews. You're asked about it. And in the past, I've recognized that if I don't have some sort of answer for it that I can feel is true to me, then it ends up biting you. Because I think you end up, as somebody who's had his words in text for so many years, you're held to task about your answers and your opinions. And so, again, I go back to this, and I've mentioned it a couple of times so far in this interview. The priority for artists at this point then is to identify their intent. Because I think if you can do that, then when asked, you can explore your motivations and have an answer for that. And again, I would conclude this by saying, I don't feel that the concept that I have for the Moth quadrilogy is of such importance that people need to hear it. It's just, as an artist, the compulsion to do so is directly linked to my experience, and my experiences over the past couple of years, as it has been for many of us, most of us, is one of profound change. Even the social media discussion it's about profound change. So that theme seemed to be so prevalent that when pressed, this is how I think this concept is shaping up. It's about change.
But the Moth, at least as a name for the next record and for this musical project, that existed for a long time. I mean, the title
True.
itself, and
True.
you do seem to have, at least in the last few records, with certainly with Ruby Quaker, which is a type of moth.
Yeah.
Jane, I don't know if Jainism was about moths as well, because Jains liked a type of silk that is produced by moths.
Oh yeah. No, Jainism was about the Indian, I guess, spiritual.
Yeah, the ultra peace.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and that is why they use moth created silk.
Really? Oh, I meant to do that. I think the thing that's interesting is, like, you bring up a good point. The moth has existed for 10 years, but and this is kind of a esoteric statement to make that I'm sure a lot of people would find umbrage with, but I feel that the compulsion to create music or art, if you're coming at it from going from a place of intuition, I think the ideas you are aware of prior to ever having any awareness of it. And by that, I mean, your subconscious will aim you in the direction of what it is that you need to explore conceptually, musically, ideologically, whatever it is. And for me, I feel like I'm just dumb. So it takes me years to to catch up to what I'm feeling. But I've learned over the years that there's certain inclinations that I have for the creative process that are undeniable. And when I do get those inclinations, I'm like, there's something there. There's something to the idea of a moth, for example, even 10 years ago, that seemed to be very much in line with my creative intuition. So I follow it without questioning it. The only time I
But it's
question it,
interesting to focus on moths as a sign of change, right? Because normally when people use change and an insect, they go for butterflies, and moths are like a less colorful, chunkier butterfly. So I was interested as to why, in order to reflect change, you went for that
I
insect.
think that the thing is, ever since I was very young, in part to do with my upbringing, but also just in part to do with my psychology, I've always been interested in the nature of reality. It just seems like it's of the things that are interesting, it's a very interesting thing to me. I love the idea of nature of reality and nature of consciousness and the nature of the universe. It's all passive interest. It's not like I'm, studying this shit or anything. It's just I like it. And as a result of that, I think that my naivete as a human being makes a lot of my connection to the nature of reality uh, based on just simple human romantic tendencies. I don't fundamentally understand any of this shit, and I'm so suspicious of anybody who claims to, that I think that the moth analogy works in the sense that as a creature, they're so attracted to the light that the pursuit of it is what ultimately destroys them. So I think that there's uh, because the idea of either spiritual or existential interests are so fundamental in the work. I've always got the impression that, like a moth, my creative inclinations are based strictly on, oh, that's pretty. You know what I mean? It's not like it's not that there's some overarching message or theme or anything. It's just I'm fascinated by things that I don't understand. And oftentimes in the past, it's those are the same things that have bitten me. However, I think that there's space with a concept like the moth to have like a twist that maybe makes the whole idea of that fatalistic view of change implying death. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe that's a very human reaction to the unknown. And conceptually, I find those sorts of concepts to be really engaging. And you know what's interesting? As I was talking to somebody about the concept for the moth, and I was trying to draw parallels to things that I find interesting in order to adhere the narrative to it in a way that seemed like more personally engaged. And I found myself aware of the fact that I've always been embarrassed of the fact that I enjoy the idea of psychology. And the reason I find it embarrassing is because I guess I still feel, or felt at least, that on some level, uh, people would view that as being pretentious, rather than I just find it really interesting. I find the idea of this sense of self, or the id, or the ego, or the hierarchy of needs, and all these ways that human beings perceive their environments due to bias and pain and reward and all. It's there's no objective with it other than I simply find it interesting. So when it comes to having to write something that I think is emotionally authentic, I'd be a fool to not focus on the things that are interesting to me. But the part of that my cross to bear was like you have to get past the fact that just because you feel this is interesting, yet you feel that it could be perceived in a certain way, that would be reason enough to not to do it. So perhaps the outfit and the power nerd thing is less about being self-deprecating and more about saying, listen, I'm going to be me here. And if that's something that people don't enjoy or have perceptions of that are based on their own um, objectives or not objectives, their own perspectives, then that's fucking their problem. You know, like, I don't know what to tell you. I think the shit's interesting. I'm not an expert at it. I don't know anything about it. I just think it's interesting.
The tickets for the Moth sold out within an hour. Originally, it was planned, as far as I could see, as a single event in Groningen in the Netherlands. Then it moved to two dates. Um, why did you want to do this project just the one time? Even if we say just the 2 days in Groningen, whatever, but why not do it also in England, also in Canada or the US? Because based on the amount of people that I've seen are planning to come to the Netherlands from all over the world just to see it. Clearly, you could have done it more than just these 2 times.
It's proof of concept is what it is, because the objectives for the Moth are so far-reaching and so ambitious, and I currently don't have the funding to do any of that. And I think that what is a practical move for somebody in my position is to do a proof of concept, because there was a lot of talk prior to those shows selling out so quickly that they weren't going to sell out. And the conversations I was having with the orchestra and the amount of liability insurance that we had to take out for the sake of, who pays for it if it doesn't recoup, or, for example, little things that I would never expect, like, between a 60-person choir, 100-person orchestra, band, lighting, and all that stuff, who pays for 200 chairs rental? Things like that are practical concerns. And because the area of the industry that I inhabit is um, conservative. It's not. This is. I'm not Taylor Swift, or obviously, or even Arch
Despite the
Enemy.
similarities.
Yeah, it's close. Just in terms of my connection to sequins. But I think that with that, it pays to be careful, because I would have been out personally 50,000 euro if it didn't break even. So, I had to be a little more careful with it. The encouragement that comes from the sellout is great, and since that time, I've been presented a couple of other opportunities with other orchestras. But the concept that I have for the Moth is a film, a stage performance, and it's really ambitious. So, in order to fund that, I'm going to need millions of euros to do so. And I obviously don't have it. I got, maybe 50 grand to do the thing. So, what I've spent that money on so far is two conservative shows with an LED screen that allows me to present a rudimentary version of the film and then perform it to the best of my ability, because the music is really over the top. It's not a subtle piece of music. It's fucking really intense. And my hope is that when people see it, they say, I see what this is. Musically, it was off the charts. And maybe at that point, someone will come and say, I saw the show, I want to do the film. Or I saw the show, we should do it at the Sydney Opera House, or we should do it in the West End, or we should do it in Romania, or whatever. But until such time that people have seen that, it's foolish of me to make these huge plans, because I'm not that big of an artist, right?
Can your fans expect that it could be possible that there would be more proofs of concept concerts
Well,
elsewhere?
the idea would be, well, number one, yes, of course. But my hope is that the next ones wouldn't be necessarily proof of concept, but they would be the next level. Like, we could integrate by showing people this first show, and someone says, "Hey, we want to do that here," and I'm like, "Okay, well, you saw the show. For the next one, I'm willing to do it. It just needs to have this particular part of the performance slash orchestra slash film, whatever, augmented, so that the vision can become more in line with the original intent." And I'm absolutely willing to do so. But I'm also been doing this long enough to know that my work falls into a couple of categories. Even if I'm completely psyched on it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to translate to an audience. And that has been proven to me on a number of occasions with my work. It's just because I love it doesn't mean that it's going to resonate. I love the Moth, but I don't know if it's going to resonate. So I think that this will be an opportunity to see, but we'll know after it. The next time you and I talk, it may be like, that was fun. Dun 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 dun. Or we might be like, yeah, we did it, and now we're doing it on a bigger scale. And I got to tell you, man, the music for this is fucking wild, man. It's fucking wild. It's something else, man.
And did you end up in Groningen because of Steve Vai, by any chance? Because I remember years ago he used to do the kind of a collaboration with the North Netherlands Orchestra, right? So he would come and play with the band. So I wonder whether he recommended that particular orchestra.
No, it was a circumstance that was just coincidence. Like the orchestra came to a show I did in Amsterdam, and they were aware of my work with Steve, and they, mentioned that they had worked together. But it was less of an impetus for the work rather than I've been talking about the Moth for 10 years, and I was looking for an opportunity to debut it, but not only to debut it, but to debut it with a really good orchestra. I've had the good fortune of working with orchestras around the world, but I've also recognized that unless you've got adequate rehearsal and adequate time, it tends to be really messy. So working with this orchestra, when they approached me on it, seemed like a real practical way for me to debut this. And then when we started finding out that Steve had worked with all this, so Steve has ended up being involved with the Moth now too. So he's writing the orchestral parts for an intermission. And then when it started coming together, that was started becoming apparent that everybody had worked together before. It was just fortuitous, right?
That's excellent, man. I really look forward to it. It was very surprising to me because all of a sudden I get this email, Devin Townsend coming with the most to, of all places,
Yeah.
Groningen. Because I studied there. I went to college in Groningen,
Oh,
and
cool. I mean,
but it's in bumfuck nowhere in the Netherlands. I mean, it is.
that sounds like my type of place. To be honest, there's not a lot of bumfuck Netherlands in my experience. I mean, it's a small country with one of the most dense population of all places in the world. So when I think about bumfuck nowhere as a Canadian who lives in a country, I mean, bumfuck nowhere in Canada, dude, is like you've got 1,000 miles in every direction of fuck all, right? So I think that my experience with the Netherlands is bumfuck nowhere. There's probably a city, 50 kilometers from there. You know what I mean? Yeah. As a Canadian, I find the observation of it being in bumfuck nowhere is admittedly quite quaint. However, I will say that I appreciate the Netherlands immensely. I appreciate honesty for one, and I think that the culture there I resonate with in a lot of ways. And I mean, obviously, culturally, there's a lot of differences, and there's a lot of differences in communication as well. Like, and I was talking to a friend of mine about how the Dutch language, one of the reasons why people have tended to perceive the language as being very blunt when it comes to opinions. And I don't know if you agree or disagree, but that's what I've heard, is based on the fact that there's very specific ways to phrase things in the Dutch language as opposed to say German or English, where there's a myriad of ways to say the same thing. A lot of the reason why the conversations and the interactions I have with people in my life who are Dutch are very logical to me is because the language itself implies a need for clarity. I don't know if I'm correct, but if that's the case, I think that that's one of the things that I appreciate about the interactions there because I'm cool with the truth. I'm willing to argue it if it's truth being presented as truth that's only an opinion that I find really ignorant. But I think that if it's coming from the place of like this is my truth, I'm cool with that.
Before I started the interview, I asked a question in one of the Devon Townsend groups, and I asked them if they had questions for you. Do you mind if I ask you a couple of
Of
them
course,
just
yeah.
very quickly? Where is the power metal album that you mentioned ages ago?
I did. I got bored of it.
What's your favorite Monty Python sorry sketch?
It's funny. It didn't hold up as well as I thought it would, actually. However, if I was pressed, it would probably still be Life of Brian.
If your gift wasn't music, what would you want to have as a gift?
I think, as strange as it, I think I could have been a decent counselor. I think I could have. Uh, I think I could have done that kind of work had I been trained for it, which I'm clearly not. Um, I think that my interests in construction. I enjoy that. I enjoy decorating, interior decoration. I enjoy that as well. Um, but I mean, I think that my eggs were all in that basket from such a young age that I don't know if I ever really spent the time investigating what my other interests would be.
Have you considered revisiting the Ziltoid radio?
Briefly, but a lot of the ideas that I have a shelf life. I feel that I have enough of a creative compulsion to do it, but then once it dries up, I just run out of interest in it. And this has proved to be problematic for me in my career because I'll, for example, do a record that I'm inspired to do at the time that really gets people's attention, whatever that could be, like Epicloud or City or Ocean Machine or whatever. But then once I've done it, I've used up all the creative fuel that made it cool, and then I just got there's nothing left in the tank. And then after that, there's no reason for me to try and reconnect with an enthusiasm for something that was like periodic. So I'm constantly looking for the next thing that's engaging. And Ziltoid Radio, I had fun with it while I did, and then I just got bored of it, you know?
Is there a particular era of your music that you look back on and can recognize that that was when you were in a complete state of flow?
Probably Puzzle, I guess, Puzzle and Snuggle. Um, DevLab as well. Um, the state of flow is elusive in the sense that a lot of what I have found myself interested in conceptually requires music to act as like a jigsaw puzzle. So I really like the process of taking a complex thing and then finding an adjacent component that creates like these, it's like a watch in a way, you know what I mean? Like the little components end up creating this structure that functions as a whole. And the state of flow in that regard tends to be a little less free because that process in and of itself requires a strategy. When I'm in a state of flow, it's usually with abstract music. It's usually with either ambient or or music that has no real continuity between songs or pieces or parts or performances, and those states are obviously my favorite, but they're also the ones that are less engaging for the audience, from what I've discovered. So it's a fine line, and fortunately, I enjoy both. So I just kind of go back and forth. I don't know if there's a period though that was a state of flow. Um, they all are, and they are all not, really, in a sense.
You did Power Nerd, and you mentioned that a lot of this creativity, at least when it came to the lyrics, was very much related to the pain that you were experiencing and also learning to deal with. And this person, Richie, asks, do you feel that tumultuous times make for more powerful art?
Yes, regrettably. However, I think there's also a real danger in fetishizing the attention that comes from creating work that is tumultuous in nature. And the tendency, and I've noticed this in myself and other artists, is to become so addicted to the attention that comes from that you subconsciously create problems for yourself to draw from. And I think that if that happens, if you sabotage yourself or become masochistic in order to create issues for yourself, even on a subconscious level that you then can sort out through music for the sake of other people. I think that on a subtle level, that is much more based on egocentricity than just being like, listen, I went through fucked up shit and here's the result of it. And I would say that if the work that I do in a frame of mind that is positive and productive doesn't engage people as much as the traumatic stuff does, um, as a human being, I still value those moments extensively because I don't the byproduct of a life of trying to eliminate suffering by your own hand is music. So you just have to kind of cross your fingers in that whichever period you're in, whatever it yields resonates with people on some level. And if your objective is, which it is, to move forward as an individual, as a mind, as an artist, then you also have to take into consideration that perhaps that will be less engaging to people, you know?
How old were you when you started playing music?
Probably seriously 12 or 13, because before that all I wanted to do was ride motorbikes. I just wanted to ride dirt bikes and be a um, motocross racer. And then I had an accident when I was 12 where I went over a jump and the shock absorber came off the back of the seat and messed up my spine. Um, at that point, my parents were thrilled. They were like, "All right, get off that fucking motorcycle. That's going to kill you, and focus on music, which we know you have a passive
Here's a
interest in."
guitar.
Yeah, here's a guitar. Well, they didn't give me a guitar. I had to mow lawns for it, and it's funny. Even to this day, one of my favorite things to do is mow a lawn. I think it's great. So, there's probably something to be said for that.
Devin, thank you so much for the time that you've given me today. It has been really a pleasure. I look forward to seeing you in March in Groningen when you finally unveil the moth.
Thank you, brother.